If I had a nickel for every time people traveling across the old American West got stuck in a valley and were forced to eat one another, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but again, it is weird that these things keep happening. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. On a cold April morning in 1874, a man stumbled across the frozen waters of a lake in the untamed wilderness of western Colorado and through the front door of the Los Pinos Indian Agency. Shoeless and carrying only a rifle, a knife, a coffee pot, and a satchel, the man identified himself as Alfred Packer, asked for a glass of whiskey, and sat down to tell the staff a tale of tragedy in the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains. The 31-year-old man explained that he had joined a party of prospectors led by a Robert McGrew, who were making their way from Salt Lake City, Utah to Breckenridge, Colorado late in 1873. Having no supplies of his own, he offered $25 in cash alongside his expertise as a mountain guide familiar with the area. From there, their journey progressed slowly along the Old Spanish Trail, where the heavy January snowfalls obscured the view of the once bustling trade route connecting settlements in Colorado and New Mexico with Los Angeles over in California. And this forced them to rely on their compasses to guide their way. Supplies dwindled, wagons broke down, and draft animals were on the verge of becoming a food source, putting the expedition into dire straits before they even reached the formidable San Juan mountain range. But thankfully, as they journeyed along the Colorado River and then down I'm going to try my best with this one, the Uncompahgre, I believe that's how it's pronounced, they came to the camp of a friendly Ute chief known as Ouray, who provided them with shelter and supply and even offered to extend his hospitality until the snows melted. Most of the party took him up on the offer and remained there until February 9th, when Packer and 5 others decided to try their luck once more on the trail. During this attempt, the man explained, his feet became too frozen for him to move at the same pace as the others, leading the party to make the difficult decision to leave him behind with just a rifle and what supplies they could spare. Once he recovered enough to press on, he did so, but he failed to catch up with or even locate his companions. So, for 2.5 months, he survived off the land, working his way through the mountain passes until he found himself at the doorstep of the agency. As he finished his remarkable tale of survival against all odds, the men of the agency sat in awe. But General Charles Adams, the leader at Los Pinos, had his doubts. Though he at first believed Packer's story, he noted that something seemed off. And as it turned out, he was well aware of the ordeal of McGrew's party and had just 2 months earlier encountered another group who had splintered off around the same time as Packer's crew. Those men were reportedly found in starving condition by his herders near the Gunnison cattle camp, not far from the river of the same name. And yet here Packer stood, looking quite fat and more interested in liquor than in the breakfast that had been offered to him. Moreover, he had shown traces of mental aberration since his arrival, leading the agent to consider questions about his reliability. But still, he had no proof that Packer was being dishonest, and the man claimed to be broke, so he offered him a job. But Packer declined, instead telling the agents that he had hoped to travel back to his home state of Pennsylvania, where he had friends who could support him until he was back on his feet. In order to fund his trip, he sold his Winchester rifle to one of the agency's employees for $10, or around $276 in today's money if you account for inflation. As the story goes, he spent about 3 weeks at the agency before he departed for the nearest town of Saguache, about 40 miles to the southeast. But rather than find a way to travel back home or seek employment in town, Packer reportedly spent his time drinking and gambling. The Fremont County Record, albeit 9 years later, even noted that the man was seen at times displaying a large roll of money. Strange behavior considering that he should have had less than $10 to his name. Now, he may have won the money gambling, but if he were able to so easily turn $10 into the $70 he reportedly spent on a horse, then one must ask why he bothered prospecting in the first place. The questions grew even more numerous when several other members of McGrew's party arrived in Saguache in April 1874. They had just been to Los Pinos, and having heard from Adams the course of events described by Packer, they were adamant that the story could not be true. And they wanted to know what happened to their comrades, and they were unwilling to believe that Packer had been abandoned as he had described. And when these men confronted him in town, they found that he was also carrying items belonging to the men with whom he'd departed, such as a knife belonging to Frank Miller, a cash-filled wallet belonging to James Humphrey, the Winchester rifle he'd sold that had once belonged to Israel Swan, as well as a pipe and pocket knife belonging to other members of the party. They wondered if the rest of the group had abandoned Alfred, how were these items in his possession? By the beginning of May, Packer was being hauled back to Los Pinos for further questioning, under the threat that he would be detained if he refused. At first, he maintained that he'd told the truth. But after the evidence was laid before him, and if the papers are to be believed, after 2 Ute men approached the agency with butchered strips of human flesh, Packer broke down and admitted that the other men were dead, but by no fault of his own. He tearfully explained that his companions had perished one by one, falling due to starvation, sickness, or injury, all except for Shannon Bell, who Packer confessed to shooting in self-defense. But why, you might ask, did he fear Mr. Bell? According to Packer, he was afraid of being eaten. But you know who's not afraid of being eaten? Me. Because our partner for today's video, Delete Me, ensures that nobody knows where to find me. You see, one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think about in their day-to-day life, but are probably subconsciously aware of, is the fact that every time you fill out information on a website, it gets stored. And in many cases, you can trust the website that you are giving your information to. But there are unscrupulous ones out there who will take that data you've given them in confidence, or sometimes they'll just straight up tell you they're going to do this, but in any case, they will take your data and they'll just sell it. It could be address, email address, phone number, name, maiden name, you get the point. And this data will be sold for all sorts of purposes, usually marketing, and I used to work in marketing, I'm very familiar with this process. But the thing is, that data ends up in places that you didn't want it to go. And the process of going to all of these different brokerages and these different listing sites and everything and getting your data off of them is that you have to do that. And it takes a long time. And then you're left in this unfortunate situation where you either have to go scan the internet and try and make sure that all of your data is not where it's supposed to be every couple of weeks and spend hours upon hours upon hours making sure you're filing the right takedown requests, or you have to be okay with all of those spam calls, emails, and potentially even stalking. Delete Me takes care of the issue by going and doing that process for you. When you sign up for a Delete Me subscription, they will take the data you give them, they will scan the internet for it, and then they will file the takedown requests on your behalf. And because this is something that's just kind of ongoing, your information is always being bought and sold, they will continue to scan and continue to file takedowns so long as you are using the service. As a niche internet micro-celebrity, I love this because it helps me to ensure that I am safe, because there are crazy people out there. But it also helps prevent people from trying to scam me, scam my family members, steal identities, things like that. And these are all very, very useful tools to have in your toolkit. So if you would like to give Delete Me a shot at making sure your sensitive information is removed from the internet, you can get 20% off any Delete Me consumer plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use promo code LORELODGE at checkout. Again, that is 20% off all Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use promo code LORELODGE at checkout. Alfred Packer gave his confession on May 8, 1874 at the Los Pinos Indian Agency in the presence of General Charles Adams, Mrs. Adams, a Miss Gauss, and an agency clerk by the name of James P. Downer. And in the short written statement, he gave a brief explanation of the horrors experienced on his journey to safety, beginning with the death of Old Man Swan, whose rifle he had sold upon his rescue. Swan passed 10 days out from camp, and while the circumstances were not clarified, Packer did admit that he was eaten by the other 5 persons. And just 5 days after that, James Humphrey was dead, and he too was consumed by the others. Sometime afterward, while I was carrying wood, Packer dictated, Frank Miller met his end. He explained that the others told him that Miller was killed in an accident, and that they proceeded to eat the man they had known as Butcher over the next several days. But when that source of food ran out, Bell dropped all pretense of waiting for his companions to die, and he shot young George Noom with Swan's rifle. At that moment, Packer seemed to be saying, he realized that the only way he could survive was if he killed Bell before Bell got to him. And Bell then proved him right by striking at Packer with a rifle, apparently a different run from Swan's, only for the gun to hit a tree trunk and break. Then, acting out of self-preservation, Packer drew his revolver and shot his only remaining companion. He took a large piece of Bell along with him, traveled another 2 weeks with it, and then arrived at the agency, which was at that point just 20 miles away. Adams, it seems, was willing to believe this to be the case, but only if Packer's story could be corroborated to some extent. To that end, he asked Packer to show some of his men to the location of Bell's remains and his reportedly broken rifle. And Packer, having no other options, agreed to do so. Adams placed an agency clerk by the name of H.F. Lauder in charge of the team who would accompany Packer, and it didn't take Lauder long to begin doubting Packer's claims, both of his actions and of his skills as a mountain guide. And this was largely because they went in the wrong direction almost from the beginning, wandering the mountains until Packer admitted that he was bewildered and unable to go any further. According to the Fremont County Record, things came to a head when Lauder caught Packer attempting to murder him in his sleep, though other sources claim that it was a more brazen attack in broad daylight. If the incident did indeed happen, then the former seems more likely to be the case, as a daytime attempt would have been nearly impossible to escape from. Either way, the result was that Packer was made a prisoner, bound securely with ropes, taken back to the agency, placed in irons, and then turned over to the sheriff of Saguache County. So, as Packer sat in jail in Saguache, and yeah, I did just look it up because I felt like Saguache simply could not be the correct way of pronouncing this, but anyway, as Packer was sitting in jail, Adams oversaw efforts to locate the bodies of the missing miners. And this mostly meant informing passing prospectors, other miners, and hunters that they should be on the lookout for the remains, which were believed to be somewhere in the vicinity of Lake San Cristobal. Several months passed, and then in August, a sketch artist by the name of J.A. Randolph was on his way to Lake City when he stumbled across a grisly scene, one that utterly contradicted the story Packer gave Adams a month prior. That is to say that rather than just one body, there were 5, and it was clear that each and every one of them had been deliberately slain. Harper's Weekly, the publication for which Randolph worked, went on to report in October of that same year that marks of violence on each body indicated that a most terrible crime had been committed here, and that the bodies lay within a few feet of each other in their blankets and clothes with no attempt to conceal the remains. Upon his discovery of the bodies, Randolph drew a sketch of their positions and the state of their decomposition, which was not itself uniform. Bell and Noon appeared to be the least decomposed, while Humphrey, Miller, and Swan were skeletal, and the latter two were missing significant portions of their bodies. While later reports such as that in the Fremont County Record would go on to claim that Bell's skull was missing, and that the other 4 had been shot in the forehead, it's quite clear from the sketch that this was not the case. What wounds they did have appeared to have been caused by a cutting instrument, and in this case most likely a hatchet. It was also clear that there had been extensive butchering, though at the time the papers incorrectly reported that only the body of Shannon Bell was used for that purpose. After the coroner made his way out to the scene, and once the bodies were positively identified by members of the McGrew party, they were buried on the spot. And with all the evidence they could possibly need in hand, the authorities returned to Saguache to formally charge Packer with murder. But when they arrived at the jail, they were astonished to find that he was missing. Alfred Packer spent 9 years on the lam and had a high price on his head. And then, on January 29, 1883, his carefully plotted attempts to stay ahead of the law came crashing down. Packer had been working near Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, under the name of John Schwartz, when a man who knew him from the past recognized him, and that man put in a tip to the sheriff in Laramie City. A deputy brought Packer in, and once word reached the Hinsdale County Sheriff, as the bodies were found in Hinsdale County, the sheriff of that county traveled north to extradite Packer back to Colorado. And there, Packer asked that he be allowed to provide his statement to General Adams, for the reason that it had been General Adams who took his first one. Now, Packer's second statement was far more detailed than the first, beginning with their departure from Ouray's camp rather than with the death of Israel Swan. And as he told it, they left the camp with enough food for 1 man to last 7 days, which was nowhere near enough for 6 men to travel the 40 miles they believed they had to cross, and in reality it was more like 60, and that was if they could go in a straight line. Packer wrote that they encountered a storm after just 2 or 3 days, then came to a mountain, crossed a gulch, and came onto another mountain, where they found the snow so deep that they had to opt for the windswept ridges as opposed to the route recommended by Chief Ouray, which would have taken them along the Gunnison River east towards a cattle camp. By their fourth day, they were down to just a pint of flour to eat, and rather than turning back for Ouray's camp and the safety that awaited them there, they decided to press onward along the mountainside. By the 10th day, they had entered what Packer referred to as the main range, and were living on rosebuds and pine gum, and he said that some men were even crying or praying. After pressing through the rugged mountain terrain, they came out at a stream which runs into a big lake, camping first along the waterway and then for a second time just above the lake, that being Lake San Cristobal. It's extremely difficult to determine exactly what path they may have taken, as the location of Ouray's camp is only ever given in the sources as being in the Uncompahgre Valley, near Montrose, Colorado, and along Dry Creek. But given where they started and where they ended up, it seems that he was probably referring to the ridges north of and surrounding Uncompahgre Peak, a towering mountain just 10 miles from the site of the bodies. Some of these words, guys. In any case, it was while they were camping above Lake San Cristobal that everything went to pieces. According to Packer, he had been sent out to observe their surroundings from higher up on the mountains on the eastern side of the lake, and he claimed to have been given Swan's rifle, then said that he traversed through a gulch and then up onto another mountain, but he could see nothing but snow in every direction. He then returned after spending half a day hiking about, only to find that a massacre had taken place while he was gone. "I found the red-headed man who acted crazy in the morning sitting near the fire," wrote Packer, "roasting a piece of meat which he had cut out of the leg of the German butcher. The rest of Frank Miller was lying on the ground down by the stream, a hatchet buried in his cranium. Humphrey, Noon, and Swan were also deceased, and their hatchet-stricken bodies laid by the fire in various positions." And at this point in the video, it seems reasonable to say that if I had a nickel for every time I did a story about red-headed cannibals, I'd have 3 nickels, which is more than 2. Now, if Packer was to be believed, then he barely had time to process what he was seeing before Bell, armed with a hatchet, charged towards him in a blind fury. But Packer, a veteran of the Civil War on the Union side, reacted swiftly, firing a shot through Bell's belly and causing his assailant to drop his axe and fall to the ground face first. Packer said that he then lifted the hatchet himself and brought it down onto the top of Bell's head, finishing him. And after that, he sat down by the fire to think. Packer claimed that the next day he attempted to follow his tracks from the previous day as a means to get out of the valley, but he failed to do so due to the depth of the snow. And he decided that his best course of action would be to set up a more permanent camp, constructing a shelter of pine boughs which stood 3 feet high. Following this, he went back to the fire and covered the bodies of the men in their blankets, and then took the leg Bell had supposedly cut from Miller. He then made a new fire closer to his shelter and used it to cook the meat, which he begrudgingly ate out of sheer desperation. The rest of his meals came in the same manner, as he failed time and again to make his way out of the valley and over the mountains to the east. In this way, he became something of a one-man Donner Party, trapped by circumstances outside of his control and forced to live off the remains of the fallen. It was only once the snow began to crust that he was able to blaze a trail out of his predicament, carrying nothing but a single blanket, Swan's rifle, $90 in cash, a different number than what he gave in his first statement, which was $138, his coffee pot, which was filled with embers, and a satchel full of minor meat cooked before he left the camp by the lake. As for the alleged attempt on Louder's life, there was no mention of it, and to be fair, there may be good reason for that. The articles which mention the attempt on Louder's life also get various details about the situation wrong, and I found no mention of the event in any of General Adams' correspondence with the head of the department about the situation or otherwise. And given the era, it would not be out of question for the stories to have developed as something of a whisper down the lane situation. As I previously mentioned, the Fremont County Record incorrectly stated that Packer had shot all 5 men, while the Philadelphia Times falsely claimed that Packer had acknowledged that he had grown quite fond of human flesh and coolly said that he found it to be the sweetest meat he had ever tasted. It's very possible that this detail was an embellishment and that in reality Packer was held solely because he failed to guide the party to the right place and thereby prove his story to be true. And of his escape from jail, he said only that he was past a penknife blade, which he used to unlock his cell door. Adams did not believe Packer's story, and on April 4th, 1883, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat printed a dispatch from Lake City, which explained that the trial of Alfred G. Packer, the murderer and man-eater, was to begin on that same day. Now, Packer, who had spent nearly a decade on the run, did not have much sympathy in the area. Little was printed of the trial details, but the state was able to call quite a few witnesses to the stand on their side. According to the article, Preston Nutter, George Tracy, Robert McGrew, O.D. Lautzenheiser, General Adams, Steve Dale, Herman Luders, H.F. Louders, former Sheriff A.P. Wall, Otto Mears, J.H. Downey, Larry Dolan, E.T. Hotchkiss, and A. Hartman all took the stand, as well as other unnamed members of both the McGrew Party and the Saguache community. Within a week, Alfred Packer was convicted for the murder of all 5 of his companions, with Judge Jerry handing down the sentence that he was to be executed by hanging on March 9, 1883. Now, if you go and read about this case, there are 2 versions of this sentence that you'll find just about everywhere. One is the actual sentence, presented in the proper legal terminology, and the other is one that is described as having appeared in a local paper and attributed to Larry Dolan, owner of a Saguache saloon. And while I was unable to track down the origin of the quote, it does actually play a rather important role in the mythos behind Packer's 1886 appeal trial. Because, according to Dolan, Judge Gary gave the sentence as follows. Hang on. Aiden, the mood lighting. Thank you. Stand up, you voracious man-eating son of a bitch, and receive your sentence. When you came to Hinsdale County, there was 7 Democrats. But you, 5 of them, goddamn you. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you're dead, 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 as a warning against reducing the Democratic population of this county. Packer, you Republican cannibal, I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it. Like I said, I couldn't locate the original paper in which this was published, but many versions of the story have used it to suggest that Packer's appeal was based on the argument that he was a Republican in a heavily Democratic county, and thus the jury cannot have been impartial. On the other hand, there don't appear to be any scholarly sources or primary source documents available to corroborate this claim. They could exist, to be sure, but I was not able to track them down if they do. But what I did track down was an article by University of Alaska Fairbanks professor Deanna DiStefano, who has a much longer bibliography on this topic than I do. And in her piece, entitled Alfred Packer's World, Risk, Responsibility, and the Place of Experience in Mountain Culture, she confirms that there was a change in venue, but more for the purpose of obtaining a jury with fewer emotional ties to the story. According to her, the meat of the argument was that because lawmakers had repealed the territorial murder laws in 1881 in favor of new state laws, Packer could not be charged with murders that had taken place in 1874. Shockingly, the argument actually had precedent. Though Packer was convicted in 1883, his lawyers were able to stay his execution long enough for the legal winds to blow in their favor. And in October of 1884, the Colorado Supreme Court ruled on a different case, that of Al Garvey, finding that prosecutions of murders before May 28, 1881 were invalid, but that those convicted of such an offense could still be retried for manslaughter. And so it was that in 1885, the Colorado Supreme Court ordered a retrial of Packer's case. On August 13, 1886, the Ogden Daily Herald published the results of Packer's appeal trial. The journalist described in great, though questionably accurate detail, the testimony of the accused murderer and admitted cannibal as he hoped to gain his freedom. "My name is Alfred Packer," he reportedly began, "and I have been in the mountains for many years. I was in Utah in 1873, and I worked in the mines there until I became leaded. A term that the paper explains is a form of lead colic peculiar to the men employed in the vicinity of the smelters in Utah and Nevada. After that, he'd gone to Salt Lake, where he worked as a smelter and exacerbated his condition further. But it was because of this affliction that in the fall of 1873, he joined a party at Bingham Canyon for a prospecting trip to the San Juan country in Colorado territory. Now, in this version of events, he had given McGrew $30 in order to join the party, and this actually left him with $25 of his own. From there, though, the story was much the same that it had been. He continued that they reached Ouray's camp on Dry Creek in January of 1874, then departed once more for the San Juan Mountains. It was cold, he told the jury. The snow was deep and travel difficult. And as before, Israel Swan was said to be the first to die, though in this telling, he reverted back to the claim that this was indeed an issue of starvation. Similarly, he was still the one sent off to search for something, but this time he was looking for food rather than a way out. The story of Bell's death and the finding of the other bodies also remain much the same, yet the timeline had shifted such that Packer waited 2 weeks to eat his companions, and he said that he felt sick the first few times. It was much the same for his story after reaching Los Pinos, though the article strangely says he arrived first at Sawatch. It should be said that the timeline between Packer leaving the mountains and giving his confession is extremely difficult to nail down. Some sources claim that he spent 6 weeks in Sawatch, while others say that he only spent days there. He himself gave a statement saying he spent 3 weeks at Los Pinos, but if he arrived on April 16th, then he can't possibly have gone to Sawatch at all, and then still returned by his May 8th confession. Additionally, nobody seems to be able to agree on where precisely the Los Pinos Agency even was, with some sources placing it on the New Mexico border, while others say it was in Cochetopa Pass, and others still simply say it was south of Gunnison. In any case, Sawatch is many miles east of the nearest possible location for the agency, making it difficult to comprehend both the chronology and geography of the story. What is clear from Packer's statements and the remarks of others is that he was in Sawatch at some point before the search party was organized. At the appeal, he claimed that he wanted to go back to Los Pinos of his own volition, and also implied that he was eager to prove his story, but did genuinely get lost while trying to lead the party back to the camp. And in his retelling, it was at this point that he became a murder suspect, though Adams clearly had his doubts before that expedition was out the door, as expressed in his letters back to D.C. Once again, Packer's story about his release and what happened afterward were of scant detail, and those few details did not match his first retelling. Finally, Packer told the court, "I am accused of robbing the dead. Yes, I did rob the dead when I cut the flesh from the bodies, preparing to start over the range in search of civilization. I then took $5 from Swan's pocket, a $50 bill from Bell, and $10 from Miller. Here is where I did wrong. I robbed the dead, but I knew the money would do my dead comrades no good, and I, being yet alive, thought the money might help to save my life. I'm willing to take the blame for robbing the dead, for it was wrong." And to be fair, if the story did go as Packer told it, that's a very reasonable way of explaining yourself. If all of his comrades did tragically die and it was not his fault that it happened, he was correct in saying that the money was going to do them no good but might save his life. But of course, all of that hinged on whether or not Alfred Packer was telling the truth about the sequence of events. And that, of course, is what the prosecution was attempting to prove he was not doing. Now, the paper did not record the arguments of the prosecution, only reporting that on the cross-examination, the prisoner was confused by the cunning questions that were put to him, and that Packer became enraged and branched off a fearful tirade of abuse against newspapermen, the prosecuting counsel, and just about everyone else involved in putting him in jail. Though the writer does assure us that the cross-examination uncovered the weak points in the narrative, and that the witness testified to impossible circumstances, precisely what this bulletproof argument was may never be known, at least not without an in-person visit to the Lake City Records office, assuming they haven't been lost in a fire, which is a lot more common than you'd think. In any case, the result was another conviction, but this time for 5 counts of manslaughter and a total of 40 years in the state penitentiary. So, in a way, Packer had won his appeal, just not to the extent that he had hoped, and he wasn't ready to let it go. Packer spent years continuing to appeal his case, and also wrote quite a few letters and correspondences trying to plead his case with journalists and benefactors and other people. And on August 7th, 1897, Packer penned a letter to a Mr. D.C. Hatch of Laramie Street in Denver, Colorado. And in this letter, he provided by far the most detailed account of his time in the mountains, the deaths of his comrades, and the ordeal he faced as he made his way back to civilization. For the first time, he made mention of the party who had left before him, under the guidance of a man called Lutzenheiser, the very same who had testified against him in 1883. According to Packer, Urey told Lutzenheiser that the Los Pinos Agency was only 40 miles away, when in reality it was closer to 80. But what Urey had actually told Lutzenheiser was that a cattle camp owned by the agency and located near modern-day Gunnison was 40 miles away. But it is possible that Packer had genuinely misunderstood. Packer also asserted that Lutzenheiser's party had run out of supplies and also considered cannibalism themselves, and that they had even gone so far as to draw lots, but that they were rescued from this fate by the appearance of a coyote, which they shot and killed. Saved from complete starvation, Lutzenheiser's party made it to the cattle camp Urey had told them about, where they allegedly shot and killed a cow to eat before being discovered by the ranch hands. They were subsequently taken in and fed, and once they physically recovered, they made their way towards the Los Pinos Agency, which Packer described as being 40 miles into the mountains, which still doesn't help in figuring out where this place was. And all of this, Packer said, was sworn to at the time of his trial and was a matter of court record. Now, of his own party, he said that they chose to take a different trail to the agency, one which most certainly did not exist given that they ended up in the Lake City area. The story was much the same as before, but now with the added menace of a slowly maddening Shannon Bell, the strongest and most able-bodied man of the party, who had succumbed to the power of mental derangement and was causing the party to be very much afraid of him. Packer also once again changed the reason for his trek up the mountainside on the day of the massacre, now claiming that it was indeed for the purpose of scouting a way out after all, and that this time it took him a full day rather than just half of one. As before, when he returned to camp, Bell charged him with a hatchet and got a bullet in his gut for the trouble. It was only after realizing that the rest of the camp had not woken up from the crack of the rifle that Packer claimed to have realized something was wrong. And upon closer inspection, he found that all of his companions were dead, slain by the crazed Mr. Bell. He spoke very little of the actual cannibalism, saying that he could remember little due to the haze of starvation until he arrived at the agency, and then reiterated that he spent 3 weeks there, though in this version of events he was confronted by the rest of the McGrew party and their Ute guides during this time, leaving no room in the story for his reported stay in Saguache, which he referred to as Saguache spelled differently in the letter. In any case, he said that they questioned him as to where his comrades were, and that he told them Bell had killed everyone else and that he had killed Bell. This, of course, contradicted his earlier statements, and he also said that he went with everyone to Saguache after being questioned, and that they waited there for Adams to return from a trip to Denver. The problem with that claim is that Packer arrived at the agency on the 16th of April and gave his confession on the 8th of May, leaving no room for his extended trip to Saguache. He also said that he went with everyone to Saguache after being questioned, and that they waited there for Adams to return from a trip to Denver. The problem with this claim is that, once again, if Packer arrived at the agency on the 16th of April and gave his confession on the 8th of May, there is no time for this supposed extended trip to Saguache. There is also the issue of whether or not Adams was present on the search expedition reportedly led by Lauder, as I found no records of his being there outside of 2 quotes from Packer, which argue that he was. Either way, the version given in 1897 once more toned down the nature of Packer's involvement, with the claim that it was the snow which turned them back, and not his failure to lead them where he said he would. He then alleged that it had been Sheriff Amos Wall who released him, telling him to go away and not permit it to longer worry him. In closing this letter, Packer offered a long soliloquy on his motivations, lamenting his condition and the charges laid against him, if not for the sake of his freedom, then for the sake of his reputation as a man. He did, however, offer the statement that all the brightness in the firmament of my earthly future is centered in the hope that I may eventually be given an opportunity of proving to the world that I am less black than has been painted. Finally, he thanked the recipient of his letter, Mr. D.C. Hatch, for his expressions of goodwill, and finished with the line, "Oh, my friend, were it not for the flame of hope which forever burns within the human heart, life would certainly be beyond endurance." But as it turns out, in the end, Packer's refusal to give up hope and the efforts of his friend Hatch did pay off. In Denver, journalists worked hard to clean up Packer's image, reframing his story as one of a desperate man lost in the wilderness and compelled to eat his companions, rather than the greedy, murderous rapscallion the people of Lake City and Saguache believed him to be. The power of nostalgia for the early days of prospecting, writes DeStefano, when men battled the elements, resonated with the more civilized society of Denver, a city which, at the time of Packer's alleged crimes, had a population of only 5,000, and had since grown to over 100,000 inhabitants. The result was that by 1901, Packer's story was viewed more favorably by those living in electrically lit cities far from the mountain wastes, and in his last official act as governor of Colorado, Charles S. Thomas granted parole to the cannibal Alfred Packer, potential but unproven murderer. But nearly a century later, in 1989, Professor James Starrs of George Washington University set off to answer the question of Packer's guilt once and for all. Having already performed similar studies on Lizzie Borden and Jesse James, Starrs sought to exhume and then examine the remains of Packer's alleged victims in order to determine if a manner of death could be established. Analysis of the bones, writes Andrew Curry for the journal Archaeology, revealed ample evidence of violence. And in addition to the obvious signs of blunt and sharp force trauma, anthropologist Todd Fenton explained that they were able to conclusively determine that almost every piece of meat on the bodies was removed, with most of the cut marks appearing on the backs of Packer's companions. To some members of the team, this suggested that Packer was reluctant to look his friends come food in the face. But that didn't mean that Packer was innocent in their deaths. Starrs was of the opinion that Packer must have been the killer, based on defensive wounds found on the arms and head of George Noon, who was the youngest member of the party at just 18. Now, as for why Starrs felt that it must have been Packer rather than Bell who did this, it was because an old war wound would have made Bell a bad axe murderer, unable to overpower the younger Noon. According to him, the most likely scenario is that Packer killed all 5 with an axe, though this opinion is not without its rivals. Historian David Bailey argues that Packer could have been telling the truth, and that the evidence lies with what Bailey argues is a bullet hole in Bell's hip bone. You see, back in the 1950s, a revolver was located at the nearby Cannibal Mesa, named for precisely what you'd expect, and though badly decomposed, the converted Colt 1862 police model, which is what they said it is, not what I said it is, I'm just going based off of what they described, still had 3 bullets in the cylinder, and this proved crucial in identifying it as the gun used at Packer's camp. Bailey's team tested the soil where Shannon Bell had been buried and found traces of lead, which, when compared with the unused ammunition in the revolver, proved to be a perfect match. Bailey then pointed to a picture taken by Starr's team, in which he argued that a bullet hole was visible in Bell's hip, suggesting that the presence of the lead, the match to Packer's gun, and the wound itself were evidence that Packer really had shot Bell. And given the circumstances, Bailey argued that this could indicate Packer drew his weapon in self-defense, and thus his story could have been true all along, though he didn't go so far as to say that it was. Starrs, on the other hand, argued that there never was a bullet hole, and that what Bailey saw in the picture was a gnaw mark from a scavenging animal. But Bailey contended that a bullet hole could have been gnawed later, and that his position is supported by the historical evidence. Trial testimony from a member of the coroner's party, Curry's article explains, noted a piece of hip bone with a bullet through it that lay near one of the bodies. In addition, the testimony included mention of a pocketbook with a bullet through it as well. Starrs proved the party members were traumatized and murdered, Bailey told Curry, but he didn't prove who did it. Now, Packer, being the only one to walk away from the scene alive, would be the natural suspect. But then again, nobody can prove that he was lying. Now, his story did change a number of times. First, it was one in which he had simply become separated, and then one where they had eaten men as they fell dead, and then finally we got the version where Bell had slain them all in one place, and then himself been shot in self-defense. Still, that progression does make sense to some extent. Packer understandably wanted to avoid mentioning the cannibalism, and he knew that the men wouldn't be around to correct the record, so lying about it isn't totally unreasonable. His second version could actually be seen as something of a mercy to Bell and the others, making them all victims of circumstance instead of painting Bell solely as a crazed villain. Once the bodies were found, however, there could be no denying that it had happened all at once, and thus Packer was forced to admit the full truth, at least as he would have us believe it. And realistically, if he'd given that version first, everyone would have suspected he was lying from the very beginning, so in a way he could have just been hedging his bets. Now, the lies don't inspire confidence, but the final story isn't exactly far-fetched. Bell was reportedly the largest and strongest of the group, and would have been capable of handling his companions in their weakened state. So, if he'd already eliminated the other 4, then there's no reason to doubt that he'd have tried to get rid of Packer too, and thus Packer shooting him makes sense. On the other hand, Packer described the massacre as having happened in broad daylight, so it's hard to comprehend the fact that all of them seem to have been butchered without 1 or 2 finding time to gang up on Bell or run away. That little caveat would suggest that the murders happened while everyone slept, which would make Packer the much more likely assailant. And if that were the case, then it would be plausible that Bell was the last to go, and that Packer shot him because there was no longer a need to keep quiet. And given the signs of struggle on George Noon's body, one could construct a scenario in which Packer managed to get through Humphrey, Swan, and Miller, only for Noon to wake up, put up a fight, and in doing so, rouse Bell. Unfortunately, if Packer did kill his companions, it's unlikely that that will ever be proven. Without further evidence, it's kind of impossible to come to a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. And after Starr's excavation, the remains were given proper funeral rites, reinterred, and then covered with a large steel plate to prevent grave robbing or accidental disturbance. So, if anything in that site could have told the full story of the Colorado Cannibal, it was buried with his victims. Now, I gotta say, it's been a while since I got to ask this question about something where I felt like there were legitimately two sides to argue, but I am curious what you guys think. So if you want to leave a little comment giving your opinion on what happened here, if you think that I missed anything, if you think I mispronounced some things, I probably did, then please let us know. The comments are great, they allow us to interact with you guys, and they help the video get more views. Speaking of which, if you wouldn't mind leaving a like, because if you're still here, I figure you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it. And if you would like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge more than just giving us views and likes, then you can do that by going to patreon.com/thelorelodge and becoming a member. It's just $1 a month, and it gets you access to exclusive content, gets you access to the scripts for these videos, which I promise I am working on actually making that happen, because there's a lot that are just bullet points, and they need to be condensed into paragraph form. But they are coming. And there are several up there right now, don't get me wrong. There are a number of our scripts up right now. There are also higher tiers on Patreon. They go up to 5, 10, 25, 50, and 100, and those come with fun little gifts like hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, you get it. Also, I do want to bring up our Discord. You should join that. It is bit.ly/jointhelodge. It is the best place to get updates on all of our stuff and interact with our community. And if you are looking to represent that community, you can do so by wearing the lodge. And to do that, you just go to wearthelodge.com. I'm kidding. You go to bunkerbranding.com and scroll over to the Lore Lodge. We have 4 designs, 2 hoodies. They are great. They are very comfy cozy. They're made in America. You can feel good about ordering them. And, they look nice. They're pretty and cozy. And you know what's a great thing to make you feel even more cozy while you're sitting there in your Lore Lodge hoodie? Mount Pocono Perk, the signature coffee from the Lore Lodge. I worked with Matt Moore down at Tableau Roasting Company in Kentucky to put together a blend that I wanted from my experience as a barista. I did not just pick something off of the shelf. I was like, I want this, 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 and this. Told him even what roast temperatures I wanted. And I gotta say, it is far and away the best daily drink coffee that I have had. I'm not tooting my own horn here. Realistically, I'm tooting Matt's. It is amazing coffee. Thornbury and I drink it every day. We bring it to family vacations. I've given it as a gift, and not because I get it for cheap, just because I think it's really good. You can also support Stakuyi/History of Everything the same way, because he has a coffee with them too, and we have a bundle together. And speaking of things that we have bundled with Stakuyi/History of Everything, we have a new channel called History Unhinged. It's a podcast. It goes up once every 2 weeks. It is a sit-down recorded thing. If you've watched Unsubscribe, it's that kind of vibe to it. But it's just solely about history in an unhinged way. Now, if you're looking for other ways to get more Lodge, you can do so by checking out our other channels, such as The Weird Bible, which is a collaboration with Wendigoon, my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where we do some gaming content, some reaction content, stuff like that. We have great Friday night streams where we'll get a group together and we'll play something like Sons of the Forest or Helldivers. It gets really into it. It's a lot of fun. We also have 2 other channels, those being Off the Record and Boozy Mixologist, which are about music and mixology, and I'm not on either of them. We just produce them. But if you are looking to learn how to make great cocktails from one of the best in the business, Boozy Mixologist, Celso, our buddy, he does it amazingly well. He runs workshops downstairs of where we're sitting right now, so if you're actually ever in the Phoenixville area, be on the lookout for that. Off the Record is, of course, a show about music where our buddy Luke Eccles goes and interviews people. He's going to start putting together some deep dives. We're kind of revamping these channels a little bit. They had a test run last year, and we were like, changes. And last but not least, we have our live show, The Lore Lads, which goes up every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it doesn't, and if it doesn't, we'll tell you. You can also get that on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. the Wednesday after the show. Thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.